According to the Holy Bible, Abraham entertained 3 angels. When they later visited the city of Sodom, they were believed to be normal earthmen. When the Israelites left Egypt, an angel appeared as a pillar of fire and guided them to the mountain of Horeb. The prophet Elias ascended to heaven in a fiery chariot. Ezekiel described the apparition of a great cloud with raging fire engulfing itself. In its midst, like the color of amber, also from within it came 4 living creatures. They had the likeness of a man. St. Paul reminded the Hebrews that some have unwittingly entertained angels.
There is one instance which is echoed in the Bible, which is the story of Enoch being taken up to heaven to be with the gods. In the Bible, the statement is very brief about it. There's much more about it in the so-called books of Enoch, of which we have 2 versions that describe the voyage, actually 2 voyages. One time he came back to earth, another time he was taken to be with the divine beings. And this is really a version of a Sumerian tale, in this particular case of a person called Enme-Duran-Ki, which is a title given to him after the abduction or visitation, which means the master of the bond between heaven and earth. And it specifically says that, among other things, he was taught the secrets of mathematics, the secrets of the calendar, and the secrets of the movements of the planets.
It is said about Imhotep, the inventor of the hieroglyphs and architect of the first pyramid of Egypt, that he was a student of the Watchers who came down to earth in their celestial boats. Further references to these cosmic messengers are offered in the Vedas, the sacred scriptures of ancient India, which belong to the oldest written records in the history of mankind.
According to the Vedic literature, there are many different types of human-like beings living within the universe, and they're all descended from an original common ancestor. According to the Vedic writings, there has been communication between human beings and other types of human-like beings throughout the universe for thousands and thousands of years. This used to be, in fact, more common than it is now. According to the Vedic literature, we're now in a period called the Kali Yuga, in which communication between humans and higher forms of life is somewhat curtailed. So actually the idea is that this communication was much more extensive in the distant past.
Why did these contacts take place?
Well, there's the ultimate question of purpose boils down to the question of what is the ultimate purpose of life? Why did this universe come into being in the first place? The basic concept that you have in the Vedic literature, starting in the middle basically of the explanation, is that you have living beings who have spirit souls. The soul is the essence of the being, who are in a state of ignorance. These living beings are situated in bodies made of the material elements. And because of these material bodies, they don't understand the true nature of the self. So there's an evolutionary process whereby, through experience in the material world, in different material bodies, one can gradually elevate one's consciousness. So life on Earth also is a school, so to speak, in which living beings take bodies of human form on the Earth to undergo certain experiences which in due course will elevate their consciousness. So the purpose of communication from higher beings in the universe is to aid in this process, to give people instructions which will ultimately enable them to attain to a higher platform of consciousness. So the idea is that on the Earth, people are basically living in a state of ignorance, but from time to time, beings from the higher systems within the universe will come down to the Earth and transmit spiritual knowledge to the people here on the Earth. So in this way you have different religions developing. Of course, that's a very complex process because once knowledge is transmitted to this earth, then people begin to do things with that knowledge. And so you can have the development of different religious creeds and so on and so forth.
In 1952, Lord Desmond Leslie, a celebrated fighter pilot of World War II, nephew of Sir Winston Churchill and scion of the oldest Irish nobility, wrote the first book about these obvious parallels between modern-day UFO sightings and descriptions in those ancient Indo-Vedic writings.
I was in a friend's library, and we were waiting. There was nothing to do, so I just suddenly saw this book. Or rather, it seemed to jump out of the shelf at me. Atlantis and Lemuria, written in 1890 by Scott Elliott, published by the Theosophists, with maps of Atlantis and descriptions, and all taken from the astral, the Akashic record. And it was very exciting. The thing that interested me most was the description of their flying machines, which it said was circular and glowed in the dark and could move very quickly on this free energy. And they were called Vimanas. And that got me going. I said, now wait a minute, these sound so like these flying saucers we just heard about. Remember Captain, wasn't it Mantell, Ruppelt Mantell, the chap who first saw them and described them like flying saucers. So I decided I'd do a bit of research. And I went to the British Museum Library, especially the Oriental section, where I got out the whole of the Mahabharata. Lovely English literal translation by Pratap Chandra Roy. No florid, just straight literal. And each chapter luckily had a summary. You know, there are about 20 volumes, and I waded through and picked out everything about these Vimanas. I just couldn't believe it, that the ancients had had them, and that they'd been in contact with space people. And it said by means of these wonderful craft, the star people can visit Earth, and we can visit the stars. And then it described them in Tibet as like pearls in the sky. You couldn't have had. Well, then I read on, and there was things about wars in ancient India, and some of the weaponry they used, with able to make three-dimensional images of a false army. Hologram, surely. A thing called the Brahma weapon, which had the power of the universe, and a light of 1,000 suns, which Teller then quoted. You remember about the atom bomb. And it said that the survivors rushed and bathed and threw off their arms, but a few days later their hair fell out, their skin turned red, and they died of a horrible sickness. And the army was so burned, they were just like, even the elephants were shadows on the ground. Well, that was Hiroshima, surely. So I said, you know, all this has happened before, whether it was a space war or a war among the Atlanteans, I don't know.
For one entire year, Lord Desmond searched in old libraries for references to ancient UFOs. Then he completed his book.
And then I got from a correspondent in America, Rick Williamson, who said a friend of his had had a contact, a landing, and taken these amazing photographs. So I wrote to him and said I'd written this book, and could I see his photos? Well, back they all came with a lovely letter giving me permission to use them. Nothing about any payment or anything like that. These astonishing pictures of Adamskis, which were quite unlike what we thought a UFO should look like. And we had them tested for atmospheric hazing and recession and all, and it came out that they were large objects quite a long way away and not little models close up. And he seemed a very nice fellow. And then he wrote a rather sad little note saying that I've written an account of this landing and want to publish it. So my then publisher, Werner Laurie, who was headed by Waveney Girvan, said, well, if you use his photos, you're going to kill his book, so what are we going to do? So we sort of looked at the ceiling and bit our nails, and Waveney said, why don't we have a joint publication, your book and then his as the second part? I said, well, that's a marvelous idea.
George Adamski, a lecturer on Tibetan philosophy in metaphysical circles, had observed and photographed dozens of UFOs at that time. On November the 20th, 1952, together with 5 witnesses, he drove into the Californian desert to watch for UFOs. After they had a sighting together, he separated from the group and saw a dome-shaped craft. A young man in brown overalls with long blonde hair came out of a ravine and approached him. They started communication in sign language. At the same time, his companions observed the encounter through binoculars and confirmed the contact later in notarized affidavits. Lord Desmond decided to investigate the George Adamski case on site.
Well, and I eventually got over to America at a time when you couldn't take any money out of England, 1953, and met this amazing man. And he lived in a little house up on Palomar Mountain with his secretary, Lucy McGuinness, and Alice Wells. They were very hospitable. Making a little money hadn't affected him. And he was an incredible fellow. You know, he would sometimes really annoy you by telling you the most absurd things which you knew weren't true. And at other times he'd come out with such profound wisdom. Are you going to be able to filter this off?
And you talked to him, you asked him?
I have, more or less on gestures and mental telepathy, as it is known, talk transfer.
He does not speak. I mean,
He didn't at the time, but I have met him since, and he does speak very well English as well as in the other language.
Did he tell you where he came from?
Yes, this time he told me he was from Venus, although I have met men from other planets as well.
And you have to sort of dig information out of him. Now, perhaps you remember the first contact. He said he took photos, and they all were burned or didn't come out because of the UFO being so near. I asked him if he had the negatives, and he dug them out, and they were black. But I held them up against the sun, and you could see the UFO. It was there. But you know, it needed a lot of light to see it. He hadn't spotted that. He also hadn't spotted that all the proportions of it were in perfect golden section. A lot of little details like that. Now, I asked the 2 ladies, Lucy and Alice. They said yes, they'd seen him talking to the spaceman, and they'd seen this flash as the UFO took off. And they also earlier, as he described, saw the big mothership. And that was chased away by a lot of American planes. You know, it just took off and went off.
4 years later, the U.S. Air Force project, Blue Book, officially confirmed that indeed one of their pilots chased a UFO on November the 20th, 1952 over Desert Center, California, precisely where Adamski met the spaceman.
And the other thing that worried me was the footprint of the Venusian in the sand, because it was all sort of gravel, that desert. So he directed me so I could find the place. And I read the book, and it said the visitor kept rubbing his foot into the ground. And I did that, and under the gravel was beautiful sand, and I left a perfect imprint of my own feet. So that was true.
Later, Adamski claimed he was contacted by extraterrestrials who are living among us unrecognized. They invited him to fly with them into space. Aboard a huge cigar-shaped mothership, he had the opportunity to take a look into outer space and onto the moon. He wrote a second book about these experiences, Inside the Spaceships.
Then he described to me a thing, mind you, this was 1953-54, how he saw these fireflies in space out of the UFO window, which then, 1969, the first moon trip, you know, Glenn sees these fireflies in space, exactly like Adamski. He told me there were 3 asteroid belts. Well, I believe they found a second one somewhere beyond Neptune. And he said there's another beyond Pluto. We wait and see. And he told me how when he was on the big mothership, they had this amazing, amazing movie. I've never seen anything like it. All the images, there was no screen, and everything happened all around you. Well, that was a hologram. But you know, no one had seen a hologram. They hadn't been invented.
I believe if you read this published material, you will find the descriptions of the firefly effect that was years before John Glenn reported it in 1961. The description that there are more than 9 planets in the solar system, actually 12, and we have acknowledged 11 so far. His description of the darkness of space, quite different from what you would expect to see here from the surface of the planet, also reported by the astronauts. There are numerous accounts of what he has described from space, this atmospheric collection on the moon, and activity on the surface of the moon as far as fog, clouds, water. All these things were reported by George Adamski already in the 50s, way before we had a space program. And I believe that stands for itself. People can always criticize, but I've yet to see any substantial, tangible evidence that anybody's ever come up with.
Indeed, official NASA photographs show clouds and water on the moon, although these are impossible according to science. These photos were presented by the Danish NATO exchange officer, Major Hans C. Petersen, in a lecture in Washington, D.C. in 1995.
Whether I like it or not, I have to say that science is not telling the truth. I have in my possession pictures from the moon which, one, show smoke or vapor or something else racing from a crater. Now, to have smoke racing from a crater, you need an atmosphere. Otherwise, smoke cannot race. So, moon has an atmosphere. Some advanced scientists today agree and say that the moon have an atmosphere 65% or 64% of Earth's atmosphere. Well, then it can also hold water. In one of my pictures from the moon, which I have got from NASA, you see water on the moon in an artificial water reservoir. On the next picture, which is taken by Michael Collins on his second trip around the moon, where he photographed exactly the same area, probably because he also had seen this water reservoir. The water reservoir was gone, meaning that it was camouflaged, so that we could not prove that there was any water on the moon. On another picture from the moon, we see 2 tunnels very clearly, not just a hole in the cliffs, but a nicely square, artificial made hole into. And right in front of this tunnel, in the side, left side of the tunnel, there's a huge, thick pole or obelisk, or what you would call it, which is clearly artificial. And many, many, many other things. We see objects moving and leaving tracks behind. NASA call them stones rolling down the moon's surface, but if you look closer, investigate the picture closer, you can actually see on shadow and light that it is rolling up the moon's surface, and so on and so forth. So we know definitely that science is not telling the truth about our moon. So that the world today is actually living on one big lie about their own lives. Because the governments don't tell the truth they know about the visiting space people. We have got a wrong story about our planets, about our moon. So our science is built on wrong teachings, and so on and so forth.
But where do the space people come from? From Mars and Venus, Adamski claimed. Impossible according to science, But still, Introductory Space Sciences, a textbook of the United States Air Force Academy, claims it is possible that UFOs originate from, quote, the planets in our own solar system. It furthermore confirms that one of 4 observed groups of extraterrestrials, quote, appear to be essentially the same as Earthmen, and that contacts, quote, may have already taken place secretly. Do they have bases on our neighboring planets? We don't know. Lord Desmond Leslie has another explanation.
Now, I told him at the time, I said, but surely your Venusians were etheric people and materialize because Venus is probably very hot. And he said, they were no goddamn spooks. I said, no, nor was resurrected Christ. You know, he was fully materialized, but I'm not talking. No, he wouldn't listen to that. He didn't want to confuse the issue. I think that was it. He just didn't want to confuse. Because I'm also certain that some of his trips were taken astrally, which, as St. Paul says, is so real you can't tell the difference. St. Paul says, whether I was in the body or out of the body, I know not.
I think the most important thing I learned from George Adamski is that we on Earth are not all that unique in the universe. The universe is populated with persons like ourselves, people at various stages of development. There are billions and billions of planets, around billions and billions of suns, billions and billions of galaxies. We don't know any end to the universe. But George Adamski told me that it is reasonable to believe that there are people like ourselves on other planets. Now, if we think the conditions are inimical to human life on other planets, as for instance Venus, what do we know about higher dimensionality? So George revealed to me that there are vibrations above the vibrations that we are familiar with, the vibrations which permit tangibility, the matter of touch. I would compare it, and he compared it, as to the vibrations in light. We have a spectrum, for instance, ultraviolet on one side, infrared on the other, where the vibrations which we are familiar with in the center. There's also a spectrum of tangibility in the atom itself, and this is true all over the universe. And while we're familiar only with the vibrations which make the tangibility we're familiar with possible on Earth, he was aware that there are other invisible tangibilities and that contact may be made. This ties in with the whole religious history of angels, for instance, from other places, of demonic creatures from other places. The universe is so much more complex than we had any idea of. He revealed to me this type of a universe.
Adamski's books were published worldwide, and shortly afterwards he established a global network of friends on all continents. One of them was Major Hans Petersen of the Danish Air Force, who, after UFO observations on radar and conversations with American colleagues, became convinced that Earth is indeed visited by extraterrestrials. He organized a lecture for Adamski in Copenhagen and became convinced of the reality of his contacts.
He was planning a world trip, and he asked me to organize the Europe part of it. And at that time he came to my country. Now, at the day of his arrival, my son, Lars, and I went to the local airport to meet him. And since I knew the airport well, we went to a point where we could overlook the whole airfield. And it was rather low weather. When the aircraft came out of the clouds, we saw that a flying saucer was just 20 or 30 meters behind it. And as soon as the aircraft was fully clear and ready to land, it went back up into the clouds. When I, 10 minutes later, met George, I said, there was a flying saucer following your aircraft for landing. He said, oh yes, the boys always follow me. And this he proved later on his trip through Europe. and we arranged a hotel for him in the outskirts at a small town which had a harbor. And we knew that nobody could disturb him because nobody would know that he would be staying there. When they came late afternoon or mid-afternoon and checked in, the receptionist said that there had been a young man calling for him. Everybody wondered, but George, he just smiled. Now he said, I would like to rest a little bit so you can come and pick me up again at 6 o'clock for this round trip. So they did. In this old-fashioned hotel, like in many other old-fashioned hotels, there were double doors to the rooms, one opening to the outside and one opening to the inside. So there's a space between the two doors. When the group came to pick up George, there was a ladder laying between the two doors. And on the front side you could read the word Adamski. So he opened the ladder, and inside was a message saying, Adamski, do not go to Finland this time, trouble for you, and signed with 6 words. He phoned me and said, I don't feel well of going to Finland because I got this warning. And I persuaded him to wait because it could be somebody who trying to make some fun out of it. Next morning early he called me again and he said, I met a spaceman this morning, a man from Venus, and he handed me a small parcel which he asked me to develop to the Pope in Rome. So I will definitely not go to Finland, and I'll also not go to Germany. So please make arrangements. And I did. Meanwhile, our group in Copenhagen was a bit skeptical that a spaceman had been around in their environment. So they went to the harbor where there was an old fisherman who used to fish very early in the morning, and they found him and asked him if he had been fishing this morning, and he said yes, he had. And they asked him if anything special had happened, if he had talked to anybody, something like that. He said, no. Oh yes, he said, I talked to a funny American guy, but then there was a young man calling for him, so he left and I saw they were talking together.
He came to London. He'd been to Rome lecturing, and he'd been on a European lecture tour where he met the Queen of Holland, and there was a frightful row and the students tried to disrupt it. And his lectures were run by Lou Zunstag, the niece of Carl Jung, lovely lady, with Tim Good, you know, who's written a lot of very serious books. Well, after his Roman visit, he just stayed with us for a few days to relax, and I kept the press away, and we took our little boat out on the Thames, and while we were there, he brought out some money, and among it was what looked like a little gold coin. And he just casually said, that's a bit of gold no one's ever going to get off me. I said, why, it's very nice. He said, look at it. It was a little medal of Pope John, who at that time was dying, John the 23rd. And he said, I saw him in Rome. He gave me this. I said, George, please. Nobody sees the Pope. He's dying. Tell me you've bicycled round the rings of Saturn. I'll probably believe you. But I don't think you saw the Pope. He said, well, I did. And he gave me this. And I gave him a sealed packet from the space people.